Can I have your attention, please? Can I please have your attention? Thank you. My name is Mike Grebe. I'm the president of the Bradley Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today and to thank you for participating in this symposium. We've been having these events for a number of years, and it's actually unusual for someone from Bradley to be up here offering this welcome. And that's because these events have been run each year. They have been conceived, planned, and run very well by Bill Schambra and our friends at the Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal at the Hudson Institute. Thank you, Bill, very much for everything you do. Someone from Bradley is up here this morning because the theme of this symposium involves the 10th anniversary of the Bradley Prizes. And all of the panelists you're going to be hearing from are recipients of the Bradley Prizes. The prizes are essentially a celebration of the achievements of outstanding individuals, and more important, the values underlying those achievements. Values that are consistent with our foundation's mission, which supports free market capitalism, limited, competent government, and a vigorous defense of American ideals and institutions at home and abroad. 10 years ago, when we created these prizes, it was our intention to recognize and illuminate the accomplishments of conservatives who demonstrate how a single person can help change the world for the better. And as I look at the names of the individuals who've received the Bradley Prizes over the 10 years, I think we have largely succeeded. As I look back on 10 years of the Bradley Prizes, and I have had the personal privilege of having been involved in all of them, I can't help but think about the meeting of the very first selection committee that convened in New York 10 years ago to identify the first group of recipients. And by the way, we have two of the four members of that first class who are going to be with us today, Leon Cass and Charles Krauthammer. But the individuals on that selection committee, most of whom are no longer with us, represented a pantheon, literally a pantheon of conservative heroes. And we'll always be grateful to all of them for investing their reputations in what at the time was truly a fledgling program. Included in that group on that first selection committee were Bob Bartley, Bob Bork, Bill Buckley, Paul Johnson, Gene Kirkpatrick, Dusty Rhodes, and James Q. Wilson. As I said, we will always be grateful to them for their participation. At Bradley, we believe the Bradley Prizes program is even more appropriate now than in the past, at a time when heightened commitment to first principles is so critically important to the future of our country. We will celebrate the 10th year of the prizes this evening as Yuval Levin, Paul Clement, Roger Ailes, and Mitch Daniels become 2013 recipients of the Bradley Prizes. Another thing I have to thank Bill Schambra for is the opportunity now to introduce our Master of Ceremonies. Bill Crystal is a great friend of Bradley. He is, of course, the founder and editor of the Weekly Standard, and his contributions to the conservative movement across a broad array of interests and institutions are truly monumental. Bill is also a 2009 recipient of the Bradley Prize. Please join me in welcoming Bill Crystal.
Thanks, Mike. Well, thanks, Mike. I have a very short and confined role here, which is good, so we can hear from our four extremely distinguished economists here, and one lawyer and one historian. Five? You're an economist too?
No, 5 economists. Or you're not an economist?
You know, this is the trouble with these guys. You put them up on the
We're already
you put them up on the
disagreeing.
stage, and they think they know something. You know, as I was saying, 4 extremely distinguished economists, one a very distinguished historian, and one moderator, Clint Bolick, who will recover from this shaky start of his. I'll just say a word about, as someone who's been associated informally and at times formally with the Bradley Foundation since 1985. I think one sees Bradley's contributions to not just to American conservatism or to particular areas of economic thought, of American thought, law and economics, political philosophy, foreign policy, and others, but Bradley's contribution to American life, really to American society. One sees a lot of that, but there's a lot that one doesn't see. I think when historians 20 or 30 years from now come back and write the history of these decades, they will see that Bradley had a profound role in influencing things for the better, preventing some things from getting worse, which is also important, and laying the groundwork for future achievements, I think, in many, many fields, both short-term and medium and long-term, academic and journalistic, and more directly influencing public policy and the like. So I just want to say, as someone, as I say, who's been a sort of fellow traveler of the Bradley Foundation, how terrifically important it's been and well-run and creative and thoughtful. It's not easy. My father once joked that one of the hardest, no one believes this, but it's actually very hard to give away money intelligently and successfully. And it, in fact, is difficult, I think, and Bradley has shown us all and everyone how to do it. I'm going to step aside. Clint Bolick will moderate this panel, the 2006 winner of a Bradley Prize, well-deserved, the founder of the Institute for Justice, co-founder of the Institute for Justice, and now runs the Center for Constitutional Litigation at the Goldwater Institute. As I say, he's up here in a sea of economists, and I look forward to learning a lot from them. The only other thing I've been asked to do is to ask each of you, everyone here, to both on the panel and if there are questions from the audience, to speak very clearly and distinctly for the sake, because the National Security Agency would like to be sure that they understand what you say. And there are a couple of IRS officials out there at the door who would like to know exactly what your connection with the Bradley Foundation is. I probably shouldn't even joke about these things. So anyway, let me turn it over to Clint Bolick and our first panel.
How was George? Fine?
Bill, thank you. Michael, thank you. Thank you all for being here today. And apropos to what Bill was just saying, if none of us uses our cell phone, none of us uses the internet, and no one sends any emails together today, perhaps the Obama administration will never know we were here. I was thinking on the cab ride over that it was actually 25 years this year that I filed my very, very first public interest law case right here in the District of Columbia, supported with seed funding from the Bradley Foundation, challenging a Jim Crow era ban on shoeshine stands in the District of Columbia. And when we won that case, it was the first time in 50 years that a federal court had struck down an economic regulation as a violation of the guarantee of due process under the Constitution. But just think about that for a moment. The notion that in order to fight a ban on street corner shoeshine stands, you would actually have to go to court in the United States of America, the freest nation on earth. What a sad commentary on the state of economic freedom in our country. Hopefully, we will learn today that things have improved, although I'm not enormously optimistic about that. The panel that you have assembled here today is just absolutely stratospheric, and I could spend the entire time just talking about their bios, but instead I will introduce them very, very briefly. On my right, Professor Arnold Harberger, who is a professor of economics at UCLA. To his left, the Nobel laureate Gary Becker, professor of economics and sociology at the University of Chicago. To my immediate right, Victor Davis Hansen, who is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. To my left, Alan Meltzer, who is a professor of political economy and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. And finally, to my extreme left only for today, is John Taylor, who is the Marion Robert Raymond Professor of Economics at Stanford University. I'd like to lead things off by asking each of the panelists very briefly what you believe the state of economic freedom is in the US and the world today compared to what it was 10 years ago. And let's start with Professor Harberger.
Well, I think I'm on the optimistic side of things because I specialize mostly in the economies of developing countries. And whereas the advanced countries of the world have had creeping slow growth actually since the year 2000, nothing, probably the worst decade in recent history since the Depression. The developing countries are just incredible. The poorest group of countries has grown overall at an average of about 6% per year, and the next group is about 5.5% per year. I went down the list of developing countries. I had written a monograph for USAID, and in that monograph, 4% growth really was an outlier. It was an outstanding performance, and the purpose of the monograph was to understand those outstanding performances. They were usually of limited period. In this case, there are more than 60 developing countries that average more than 4% growth over the entire decade. So things seem to be going well. Good ideas seem to be seeping down, and even being picked up by countries that one wouldn't imagine would be amenable to market institutions and whatnot. The market institutions seem to creep in by the back door or under the sill or something. And those economies are really growing, and it's, I think, great for economics and great for the world.
May even be discerning some investment tips over there.
Oh.
Gary Becker, your assessment.
Well, I tend to agree with Al in a lot of ways. I think you have to draw a distinction between the developed world and the developing world, and let's say EU and the United States. I think there's been an erosion of economic freedoms in this part of the world, partly as a result of the Great Recession, and partly it's been a long-term trend in that dimension. And so that's the depressing news. The good news is, as Al said, that if you look around the world, in many countries, there's been a movement in the opposite direction. Countries you wouldn't have anticipated doing this a decade ago. Take Africa. Take a country like Rwanda, which had a genocide not very long ago. It's been introducing gradually the rule of law, private enterprise, and the like. China moves erratically, but it's generally moving in the direction of greater economic freedom, not greater political freedom, but greater economic freedom. Mexico, our neighbor Mexico, has moved in that direction. Even Japan maybe will be moving. I mean, the Prime Minister now is calling for greater competition in Japan, greater openness. Whether Japan will be able to do it, it's too early to say. So I think if one evaluates overall what's going on, I think the countries that have been the most free economically are becoming generally less free. And many of the countries that have been not very free economically are becoming more free. So is that an optimistic view or a pessimistic view? I mean, it depends on what part of the world you're looking at.
Victor.
The biggest change in my adult life is, I think, for the first time within 3 decades, the United States is no longer, at least from Washington, the moral, ethical, philosophical spokesman for free market capitalism. It's not that avatar model that it was in the past, and that has some effects. But I'm optimistic too, but from a negative sense. I just got back from the southern Mediterranean, so I did a tour of Spain, Italy, Portugal, and southern France. And when you see these economies that have embraced statism, and you talk to young people, especially with unemployment rates of 25%, there's nobody any longer who thinks everything is going well, and they're looking for alternatives. They're not yet free market capitalists, but they're looking at it in a way that's sympathetic that I haven't seen in my lifetime. I'm also from California, a state which embarked on this experiment in statism the last 30 years and is in full-blown enjoyment of it now, and we have 1/3 of all welfare recipients. We're 49th and 48th in math and science in the United States. We have the highest bundle of gasoline sales and income taxes, and we're rated 42nd in infrastructure, even though we have the highest gas taxes. And whether you may find people embrace that in the Bay Area or in Newport, but in the other California, where I live, we have 17% unemployment rate in Fresno County, and when you are sitting on enormous resources like the Monterey Shale or timber or agricultural production, and you have these restrictions on the free market, it's very depressing. And why is it optimistic? Is because I don't think anybody within California or Southern Europe or in the EU in general is standing up and says this is the model of the 21st century. I think that was true just 15 or 20 years ago. But when people get what they want, they suffer as they should, and I think things change.
Professor Meltzer.
Thank you. Well, I don't necessarily disagree with Al Harburger and Gary about what's happening in the developing world. I am much more pessimistic about the United States and the developed world, and I am very interested at the moment and for the future in doing something which is an analog in a different way of what Clint Bullock and his friends have been and his colleagues have been so good at doing at the Institute for Justice. And that is, I'm concerned with regulation and the rule of law. We are losing, or may have lost in many respects, the rule of law. We're getting the rule of regulators. The rule of regulators is a rule which encourages corruption, crony capitalism, circumvention. A little story illustrates a part of that. A few years ago, I gave a talk at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Council is paid for mainly by Wall Street firms, so the audience was full of Wall Street firms. I talked about corruption, circumvention of regulation. First person getting up said, "I'm a lawyer. I work on Wall Street. Who do you think shows them how to do the circumvention?" "We do," with pride. You know, that told me how general it was. And now that I look into it, it is terribly general. We are losing what is an American tradition of the government of laws and not of men. We've become a government of regulators. It has terrible effects. It's anti-competitive. Large firms can pay the costs of meeting the regulation standards. They don't really object to them. Things like too big to fail, big advantage for big banks, very much against the interests of the medium-sized banks. They sell out to the big banks because the big banks get protected. They have very low capital ratios. I've worked with Senator Vitter and now Senator Brown in the Brown-Vitter bill to try to raise the capital standards to 15% minimum. We need to do things which change the way we regulate. It is not a question of being against regulation. We know as economists that there are divergences between private and social costs. What we need to do is get back into the idea of regulation, the thing which economists preach but don't practice when they come to regulation, and that is incentives. The way we want to regulate is we want to regulate so that the people who are providing social costs have an incentive to do the things which close some of the gap between private and social costs. That's a big and ambitious project. Many people tell me I'll never succeed, but if you never try, you're sure that you're never going to succeed. So I hope that we're going to try. And I believe that that is a fundamental problem which goes across not just the United States, I'm just more familiar with the United States, but it's true in Europe, it's true certainly in Japan, it's true in the developed world, and we have to try to change the arrow and point it in the other direction?
John Taylor, your assessment.
I see a quite remarkable conflicting set of trends. It's hinted at by all the panel members already, where in the sense the U.S. is going down with respect to the measures of economic freedom, and many developing countries go in the other direction. It's almost like a trading places phenomenon. And it's dangerous ultimately, not only for the United States, but for the world, because for so many years we served as a model, if you like, and led to some of the changes that have occurred more broadly. Last year I wrote a book, tried to point out and actually document these trends of deterioration of economic freedom. I looked at the rule of law, predictability of policy, reliance on markets, focus on incentives, and most important, the limited role of government. And we have, in the United States, have always been good at these. That's why the country has done so well over the centuries. But in the last few years, we've slipped. But what I think is quite remarkable, if you look at, say, the history of the last 50 years, you see some trends which can lead to optimism. In the late 60s and 70s, we were moving in the wrong direction. In macro policy, we had a lot of interventions. Regulations were increasing. We had a go-stop monetary policy, all the things that sort of against the fundamentals of economic freedom and policy. In the 80s and 90s until recently, we tended to go in the other direction. And it's just in the last few years, I don't know exactly when you want to document the change, we've slipped back again with respect to all the, whether it's regulation or macroeconomic policy. So the optimistic aspect of that is eventually people get sick of it, as they did in the 70s, and there's changes. But we can't just be complacent about that. It requires pointing it out, doing the research, and doing the communications about it.
I'd like to ask the panelists, if you could point to a single state or country as a success story over the last 10 years, what would it be, and what are the lessons that we could learn from that? Let's start with Gary Becker.
Well, I mentioned a country in my previous remarks, Rwanda. Take Rwanda. Rwanda had genocide about a decade ago. I mean, maybe a third of the population was killed, with different ethnicities fighting each other. Since 2002, Rwanda has turned things around. Been growing like 6-7% per year. That's one of your high growth countries. It's landlocked, has no natural resources. And how has it done it? I had a meeting recently with the president of Rwanda. I mean, he's not a full Democrat by any means, but nevertheless, I think he has the right attitudes. He's done it in three ways, I would say. One, security. There's no longer this ethnic fighting. Greater emphasis on the rule of law, not as much as we would like here, but a greater emphasis on the rule of law. A greater role for private enterprise. He was proud to say that the private sector is now responsible for about half of their output. Now, we would say, well, that's still too small, but 10 years ago, it was like a tenth of their output. So it's a big progress in that dimension. And the further one, and one is dear to my heart, is great investment in education. Not for a small elite, but a widespread education with minimum schooling legislation that he said is actually being enforced. They started with 6 years of required education. They moved to 8. So what's been the result? Very poor country, but they've come up very well. And I think there's a broader lesson to that. In the modern world, with the enormous trade and communication, you don't have to get things 100% right for a poor and less developed country to grow rapidly, because you can gain a lot from the technologies and the capital that have been developed in the United States and other rich parts of the world. So all you have to do is get things pretty much right, and you can do it. I mean, that's what China did in 1980, and that's what Rwanda is doing now. Now, a lot of things we would object to it, but I think it's a tremendous success story, particularly if we go back a decade ago and people would have written off this small landlocked country with very few natural resources. And by wise policies, it's managed to turn things around.
Victor.
You know, we often talk about red and blue, California and Texas, and we cite statistics on regulation and taxes and growth and population increases versus exoduses. But from a very ethical and moral human view, when you live in a state like California that has a vast technocracy, very well-paid public sector that sort of sets the rules, and it's a redistributionist economy, it filters down to real people. And by that I mean when I go to Texas and see the infrastructure of the highways or the freeways versus the 99 or the 101 that have not changed in California in 40 years. Or I look at a Texas public school that's not rated 49th, only behind Mississippi, like, as the schools that I are. Or when I know people who teach in the University of Texas system, not a perfect system, but when I taught 22 years in the California State University system, over that 22 years, professors increased by 2%, administrators by 212%. And the remediation rate of incoming freshmen when I started in 1984 was 32%. When I retired in 2004, it was 57%. And what I'm trying to get at is in a state like California, these policies have real consequences every day when you get up. You get up on a freeway and you take your life into hand when the traffic is increased 8 times and the freeway infrastructure has not, because it's gone for pensions or it's gone for 1/3 of all welfare recipients in the United States live in California. Or if you put your children in the public schools, as I did, and find out that the 8th grade reading program that you had 30 years ago is now the high school senior reading program. It has real consequences. Or if you try to teach in a CSU system. So the blue state model, everybody argues back and forth about statistics, but at the ground level, it's really a moral issue that young people growing up in California are not going to have the same ethical or moral choices as somebody in Texas, where by any natural criteria, whether we look at weather or climate or natural resources, California should be just as competitive. In fact, in many ways, it's much more richly endowed. So I think that these economic issues really have ethical consequences and ramifications, not for the elite that enact them, but for the people who have to endure them.
So California is not your nominee for the test case that we should emulate.
Well, you know, it was. I just wrote an article in the 1911 Big Creek Project when Henry Huntington, the nephew of Collis Huntington, went up in the Sierra Nevada, and in 2 years, in a series of brilliant dams at Huntington, Shaver, Florence, he created 1,000 megawatts, powered all of Los Angeles, green power for a trolley system, created enormous recreation for the Central Valley, put 1 million acres of farmland into production, and stopped the floodplain of the San Joaquin River. He did it in 24 months, 40,000 workers. It's an ecological masterpiece. It didn't alter the environment. And when I think of that and what California used to be and what the good it did, and I look at the high-speed rail where it's a $300 billion budget, 20 years, and now it's going right near my home, and it's in. The only good thing about regulation, sometimes it's stopped in lawsuits, but I don't know who would pilot it when they're going to draw from employees that are rated 49th in the country in their public schools.
Ellen Meltzer, your nominee.
Well, let me preface that by saying that years ago I used to be on the circuit giving lectures, and I was often asked the question, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And I would say, I'm an optimist. I believe the worst will happen, but not right away. Later, I read Immanuel Kant, and I made his statement the running thing in my book, Why Capitalism, last year. What he said was, from timbers as crooked as those from which man is made, you do not get straight boards. So good and bad, I don't want to bother with. Better and worse? Absolutely. Better? Absolutely better. Countries like Mexico is really doing very well and moving much more toward market freedom and social freedom both. The surprising cases at the moment for me are countries like Peru and Brazil, which are moving toward market freedom under the leadership of strictly leftist governments. That is, they elected leftist leaders and they turned out to be in favor of market freedom. I think that's a great thing. About the United States, I think we are definitely on the wrong track. One statistic which sort of tells you something like about that is the Transparency International, in its most recent poll, rates the United States about 17th in transparency and 17 percentage points behind Sweden. That's not where the United States was, and it's not where it should be, and it is where we should aspire to get back to. And we're going to do that, if we can do it at all, by doing things about the heavy hand of government, which is taking away the freedoms, regulating so that small businesses have much less opportunity. America was built to a very considerable extent by entrepreneurs who started their own little companies that got big. That's hard to do. When you read about what's going on in the credit markets, you find out that at the low interest rate policy, those companies can't borrow because the interest rate doesn't pay for the risk, and the banks can make all the money that they want to make by holding excess reserves and collecting 0.25%. Talk about corruption. 50% of those, $1 trillion of those excess reserves, are held by foreign banks who keep their money in the United States because we pay 0.25% on reserves and the Europeans don't.
John Taylor, any success stories?
Actually, there's so many. I think what you're hearing here is the reluctance to say one or two, because I think you can see so many examples where moving towards economic freedom works and goes the other direction. Milton Friedman, of course, talked about Hong Kong a lot as a great example, but we have so many now. It was Rwanda, it's Mexico, it's Brazil. I would just say this, roughly 10 years ago, the United States tried to have a reform of some of its foreign aid to developing countries. It created something called the Millennium Challenge Account. And the idea here was to take measures of economic freedom, such as the ones that put out by Heritage and others, Freedom House, and effectively rank countries on the basis of these indices, which deliver, and then alter the foreign aid on that basis. And I was in the government at that time. It was so remarkable to me is you'd have, people say the president of Rwanda come, or the new president of Brazil or whatever, come and say, hey, here's how we're doing on these things. Here's how we do. So it became kind of a competition to do better on these measures that we all think are so important. So, and I think we've seen some results just in 10 years. And if you go back with other countries, even longer than that.
Awesome. Arnold Harberger.
Well, I'm going to mention at this point Panama because I had a first experience in Panama back in the 1960s when we had the Kennedy program of aid to Latin America. And under that program, they had to provide 5-year plans. And these 5-year plans were submitted to the Committee of Nine here in Washington, the 9 wise men. The 9 wise men evaluated these plans and had put their stamp of approval on in order for the aid to flow to Panama. Well, the Panama plan had been written by a student of mine, and when the wise men had to evaluate a plan, they had a subcommittee with 2 real wise men on the plan and 2 ringers from the outside. And I was one of the ringers from the outside of this plan. And we worked through the plan, and having been written by a University of Chicago alumnus, it was a pretty good plan. And over that decade, Panama had 8% cumulative growth and had the highest rate of growth in the hemisphere. Well, when I looked at the data preparatory to this meeting, I looked at the 2000 to 2011 cumulative PhD. Who had the highest rate of growth in this hemisphere but Panama? And they have continued to welcome international business. They're a major banking and investment center for the entire region. And there seems to be no halt in their effort to transform themselves into a new Singapore or a new Hong Kong, which for a small country is a tremendous boon. And real standards of living have gone up enormously over this period from 1960 until now.
Our current debt situation traces to enormous spending increases during the most recent Republican administration. And obviously they have skyrocketed over the last 4.5 years. How much do debt and deficits matter? It seems like Republicans, at least to some extent, abandoned their traditional philosophy that debts and deficits matter a great deal. Is that something that we ought to reconsider? And I'll start with Victor.
Well, I think they matter a great deal when Republicans say they don't matter, because that gives a green light to Democrats to spend more than they would. In other words, if Republicans enact tax reductions and you get a greater aggregate growth in revenue, but that revenue does not lead to a reduction in the deficit, much less the overall aggregate debt, then it sort of discredits the tax policy. To be specific, if you talk to the general public today and you say that the Bush administration's tax policies both reduced taxes and led to greater revenue, they don't believe you, because the deficits, at least they peaked and then they started to go down before they crashed. But nevertheless, when Republicans spend at rates of 5 or 6 or 7% deficit, then it discredits their fides as guardians of the public trust and the public purse. So if they're not going to at least give lip service to debt, then I think it has enormous ramifications. And finally, there's a psychology. I'm not an economist, so I know that this is a controversial issue, but psychologically, the American people, I think, feel better, and I don't mean that in a therapeutic sense only, but they feel better that they're on the right track. They have more confidence when their government has to play by more or less the same rules that they do in their household budget. So I think it's not just an economic issue, but it's a political, philosophical, and collective psychological issue. And when we don't do it, when we don't guard the integrity of the budget, then I think others feel that there's no police on the block.
An economics perspective from Alan Meltzer.
Of course they matter. Why do they matter? Well, for one thing, because they change the allocation of expenditure in a direction away from the market and into the hands of the government, which spends much more for redistribution and much less for growth. That's one reason. The other reason is because people maybe in the 1930s didn't understand that deficits today mean higher tax rates tomorrow, but they sure understand that now. So we're in a recovery which is only one previous recovery that was as slow as this one. That was in 1930, the recovery from the 1937-38 recession, when Franklin Roosevelt became a populist, decided to do things like pack the Supreme Court, have a big antitrust program, pass an excess profits tax, do a lot of things, including not doing anything to enforce property rights when the General Motors strikers took over the General Motors buildings. That scared the bejeebers out of much of the business community. We don't have the same policies today, but we have the same anti-business mentality. The president never tires of telling people, the people who do the investment, that he wants to raise their tax rates. Well, they look ahead and they say those tax rates are going to apply when my investment comes to fruition. So I'm not going to invest. Investment is low, especially investment which involves hiring people, improving productivity, yes. Hiring people, no. So we have a repeat of the 1937-38 recovery. It didn't recover until 1942. That is, we didn't get back to the previous growth rate until after the war was underway. That's the circumstance that we're in. Debts and deficits have a lot to do with that, because they tell people resources are not going to be used efficiently, productively, as they could be, and taxes are going to be higher. And that finally, I would like to say that I once had this conversation, the following conversation, with a leading, very brilliant Keynesian economist, James Tobin, the late James Tobin. He said to me, you know, the best book on macroeconomic, Keynesian macroeconomics was written, surprisingly, at Chicago. That was Martin Bailey's book. What did Martin Bailey do that the others didn't do? He said in his book, what matters is not that the government spends money. It also matters what they spend it on. The current generation of Keynesians don't understand that the productivity with which don't seem to understand that the productivity with which they use resources is very important for the success or failure of their policies. Deficits, debt, matter.
John, does he have it right?
Deficits, debt matter. Absolutely. Right now, we're on an unsustainable path on the debt. It's projected to go above 100, above 200, above 300. If it continues on the path, the United States won't be the United States of America anymore. How it gets resolved causes a lot of uncertainty. Will it be a lot higher taxes? Will it be a default on the debt? Will it be like a crunch at some time, kind of austerity? We haven't even seen anything close to austerity at this point. So it creates a great deal of uncertainty, business decisions, what will happen with interest rates. Will the Fed actually end up trying to inflate this debt away? What will happen to monetary policy? I just give a couple numbers to put this in perspective because, of course, to get the debt to stop growing, you've got to control spending. And here's some interesting statistics to keep in mind. In the year 2000, federal spending was 18.2% of GDP. It's the end of the Clinton administration. In 2007, right before the crisis, 19.7% of GDP. It got up as high as 25, and now it's, in terms of the Senate and the administration, it's going to be 23 or so for the next few years. The House wants it to be 19. It seems to me, if you just think about what is feasible to do, what would be so hard about bringing it back to where it was in 2000 or even in 2007? And if you did that, you could basically deal with this exploding debt without any increasing taxes. I just think people don't understand these numbers. Wish they would.
Arnold Harberger.
They don't.
Well, one of my areas of work over the last 50 years or so has been cost-benefit analysis of public projects and programs. And it's all very natural economics. The first thing you think of when the government borrows money, that has a social cost, an economic cost. Unfortunately, the economic cost is not just what the government pays in interest, which today is a pittance. The fact is that by entering the capital market and sucking money out of the capital market, there's less of it left for the private investment, and therefore you're losing the productivity of that private investment that you displace by the government borrowing for its own uses. When we take all that into account, estimates today run from 6 to 7% real return as the cost of simply the government sucking money out of the economy. Well, what does that say? When the government spends that money, it's wonderful if you get a 10% return or a 12% return on something that costs 7%. But it's awful lousy if you get a 1%, 2%, or 3% return, and even worse, when you get a negative return. A negative return means the money you put in, you never even get back the capital you put in terms of benefits produced in the future. And this gives great urgency to our doing proper analyses of the costs and benefits of public projects and programs in a professional way and in advance. And I've been fighting that battle for these many years, but one of the things that comes from fighting the battle is that you also recognize that you don't have all the cards in your hands all the time. The fact is that our capacities to do a good job of anticipating the costs and benefits of projects vary greatly over the spectrum. I won't touch a defense project with a 10-foot pole because I don't have the expertise and I don't know Who has the way to quantify in dollars and cents to the new weapon system that is going to be established? But there are certainly many projects that are capable of analysis, and we know that huge mistakes have been made. The ethanol project, which supposedly was very environmentally safe and all of that, it seems that it isn't even environmentally safe and is very costly in terms of our real resources.
Yes,
And
but look
that is
how
something-
effective it is in helping people win the Iowa caucuses.
Well, there you've got it. I'll stop there.
Gary Becker.
Yeah, of course, that matters. I think what is more fundamental is the size of government. If you increase the size of government, then you have to pay for it one way or another, either today, tomorrow, or through inflation. And so the crucial lever that I think determines the productivity of the economy is the level of government. And let me put a question to the audience. Suppose the government would increase by 25%, increase taxes by 25%, no deficit. Okay, evaluate that compared to a system where government did not increase at all and you didn't have taxes high enough, so you had a deficit. Which would be better? Well, the better situation is the level of smaller government. So the two things I think are most fundamental is the level of government, of course, how the government spends its money, and the nature of the tax structure. How you, what form do you collect your revenue? Some tax structures are much more efficient than others, and some tax structures are much less efficient than others. We have a tax structure that nobody can find any rationale for it other than the role of thousands of interest groups that are getting particular benefits. So we have a terrible tax structure, a lot of inefficiencies built into it. We have a growing government, some reduction in the last couple of years, but a big government. A lot of it spent in ways I think are counterproductive, discourage people from being in the labor force, and many other negative effects. So if I have to put a ranking of what matters most, I would say number one, the scale of government. Number two, the form of the tax structure. And number three, the size of the debt. Because if you have a big government, and let me repeat again, if you have a big government, you have to end up paying for it. The government cannot avoid the basic sort of budget constraint that everybody has, that you either pay for it now, or you pay for it later, or you pay for it through inflation. So keep government down, and that, I think, would be the most productive way to have an effective government size.
I'm going to ask some specific questions to specific panelists, but I invite all of the panelists to jump in. Starting off with Victor and Gary, this is an issue near and dear to my heart. What immigration policies would be most conducive to promoting economic growth and opportunity? And I'll start with Victor and then move on to Gary.
I'm probably the lone person out here is that I don't favor the current comprehensive immigration. For a variety of reasons, I think we all agree that those people who came here illegally when it was sort of allowed, and if they are not on public assistance, they have not committed serious crimes, and they have not just recently, they should have some pathway. But the problem with that is that once you set criteria, there have to be criteria that people don't meet. In this entire discussion, nobody is saying what happens to the people who live down the road from me who have committed felonies, what happens to people who've just arrived, what happened to people who've been, and there are people who've been on public assistance for most of their entire tenure in the United States. Is this the majority? No. But if we have 11 to 15 million illegal immigrants, it's a sizable minority. So when we have this grandiose talk about comprehensive immigration reform and a DREAM Act, it means nothing unless we are assured, the public, that there are going to be people who came illegally, who did not work as we thought they would, who did not follow the rules of society, and who came belatedly to take advantage of a possible amnesty. What is the number? It might be 1 million people. It might be 10%. It could be 1.5 million people. but those people are not really being addressed. It's a therapeutic discussion where there's a DREAM Act, but for every DREAM Act, there has to be a non-DREAM Act. A couple of other things that people don't discuss in the issue. One of them is first of all, it's been so politicized that it's Orwellian. You can't use the word illegal immigrant, can't use much less the word illegal alien. But we talk about legal immigration, and we try to conflate the two. Everybody says that they support immigrants, but they suggest that the people who are opposed to illegal immigration are also opposed to legal immigration. That's not true. Most people I know want to expand legal immigration. But here, too, there's obfuscation. When we talk about legal immigration into the United States, we keep talking about skill sets. We'd like to have Serbian PhDs. We want people from Nigeria that have electrical engineering. We want people who can contribute to the economy of the United States. And we assume that everybody accepts that. They don't accept that. When I talk to people in my hometown, what made them angriest about the immigration debate? They all say the same thing: the legal immigration proposals. Why, if I could paraphrase the collective angst, why, Mr. Hansen, are you saying that some people can come in the United States with skills and some people can't? Because about 75% of the people who are coming illegally do not have a high school diploma, they do not know English, and they don't have any capital, and they have no skill sets of the type that reformists are talking about. If you translate this new system and said, we're going to make it all legal and we're going to make it based on skill sets, that's not what's being proposed in the Congress. There's still going to be a sizable number of people who will be admitted as legal immigrants because of family consideration. I think the proposals I've read, it's still a sizable majority. And when you have large influxes of people who come into the American Southwest, and the host has given up on the idea of the melting pot and has adopted the solid bowl, and you have a multiculturalist perspective rather than a multiracialist perspective, and that's what we have in a place like California, then you have enormous social ramifications. And what are those? Well, in California, we have two cultures. We have an elite coastal culture from Newport to Berkeley within 10 miles of the coast, and everybody's for either massive influxes under legal immigration, or they think that illegal immigration is sort of the paranoia of nativists of the Buchanan strike. And why do they think that? Mostly because they have high incomes, they're exempt from worries about increased taxation for social costs. Their children, if you go to the Bay Area, for example, we have a whole explosion in private academies. We don't call them academies, of course, in the Bay Area. They're schools that offer Mandarin Chinese, but they're designed for one reason. They do not want their children, these are very liberal people, in schools that have had massive influxes of immigrants from Mexico. And I find that California is sort of an apartheid state, and the issue is basically not left or right, conservative, Republican, but elite versus mass. If you're a person who's trying to work as a painter, as a tiler, as a carpenter, and you're directly opposed to people, competing with people who are getting paid cash, or if you're trying to rent out your house down a mile from where I live, and you're competing against somebody who's rented out his house and 7 Winnebagos next to it and has 50 people living there, as is also true, or you're a small farmer and you're trying to deal with a pump that's had its copper wire stolen 3 times, or you're trying to put your children in a school that 97% are failing the No Child Behind, and somebody elite says this is a wonderful system because we're bringing in people with family values, then I find that totally ethically bankrupt. So yes, we all want legal immigration. We would like to have skill sets. We want enforcement. We want a pathway of citizenship for people who play by the rules, and that's a great rhetoric, and I support it. But I don't see in the particulars of this legislation that anybody has the moral courage to say, you did not play by the rules, you are on public assistance, you broke the law in a serious fashion, you just came, you're going to have to go to Mexico, and I'm going to ensure that you do. That's not happening as I see it. I don't see anybody who says, I believe in legal immigration, and we should expand legal immigration, and we should base it on skill sets, and that means that we're not going to take 60 or 70 people, 70% of legal immigrants from Latin America based on family ties. If I would just hear that in this immigration debate, I would respect the moral integrity of the advocates. But so far, I hear all sorts of platitudes about legal immigration, platitudes about illegal immigration, but no concern about the actual reality on the ground.
Gary Becker, Immigration and Economic Growth.
Yeah, well, we have one of the most senseless immigration policies that one can really imagine. We have almost no priority for skilled workers. We have a very difficult question of dealing with illegal immigrants. We kick out a lot of people who come here, get training, and they have to go back because they can't stay, and the like. So how do we attack that problem? I'm going to put forward a proposal I put forward on other occasions. It's not something that's going to be adopted in the next year or two, so you might say it's an ivory tower proposal, but it's something I think we should aim for. And it's very simple. It says, let's use the market structure, the price system. Let's charge immigrants for the right to come. Set up a fee, and I use it in an illustration, $50,000, but it's only an illustration. Anybody other than a terrorist and somebody who's really very ill, if they can pay that amount, have the right to come. Now, what would be the advantages of doing that? One, first of all, people are self-selecting. I do not like policies where we set up criteria that if you have 4 years of college, you get 8 points, and if you have a graduate degree, you get 12 points, and so on, because no government official is capable of mimicking what the market really wants in terms of the criteria they set up. And that's why you see countries that try to set up a point system really never mesh into what the market really wants. So let people self-select. Set a price, let them self-select. Who would come? We'd get young people to be coming because they can more easily pay back the amount. You get skilled people coming because the gain from coming is greater. So you get young and skilled, both groups we want. A lot of illegal immigrants would voluntarily convert themselves into legal immigrants if they could do it with this alternative, because they would then be treated like anybody else. They can pay an amount, and they would then have legal status. And if you're an illegal immigrant in this country, your opportunities are greatly limited. You're restricted to mainly underground type of jobs and the like. And so there's a big gain to an illegal immigrant to become a legal immigrant. So this method allows them to do that, not through an amnesty program, but through they, like anybody else, can buy the right to immigrate. Now, somebody might say, well, what do you do with the people who we would like to come here but don't have a lot of resources? We would set up an immigration loan program. Think of something like the student loan program, hopefully better than a student loan program, but where immigrants have to put some skin in the game. Let's say if you take $50,000, maybe have to put $5,000 or $10,000 down, so they have an investment in being here, and they pay the rest back over a period of time. So that would allow poor but ambitious individuals to come to this country, pay it back over the higher earnings they subsequently earn. You'd also attract the people who want to make a commitment to this country, because nobody's going to pay a significant sum unless they're really thinking long-term for what they will be doing long-term, what their children will be doing long-term. So this would attract people who want to make a commitment to this country. They're concerned about their children. They're concerned about themselves in a longer horizon. So it's a simple solution. It'll cost an additional raise revenue. So if you get 1 million immigrants in, at 50,000 immigrants, you're getting $50 billion a year in revenue. So nobody could say any longer immigrants are getting a free ride. They're paying for their right to come. So to me, it's a win-win situation. Now, I said it's not going to be adopted very soon because it strikes people as really extreme and outrageous, but it goes back in a way to our policy in the 18th, 19th, and early part of the 20th century, where anybody could come if they decided to come, as long as they could pay the price, which was transportation across and making the adjustment here. And so we're going back to that, but in a modified form to take account of the fact that unlimited immigration, when you have a welfare state, is really not sustainable. So it charges for the right to immigrate, but once you do that, anybody can come if they want to come, and you no longer need government bureaucrats deciding who can come, who gets these many points, who gets that many points. So I think it's the way to go. It will solve a lot of our problems, and I think it has, I don't see any real weaknesses in such a system. It will take a rethinking of how to approach immigration policy. And so if you look at the current legislation on the board, it's a mixture of proposals. They're mixtures of point system, arbitrary limits. We'll have so and so many people coming in on H-1B visas. Now we have 65,000. We'll raise that to 125,000. Why? Because that's some political compromise. Nobody knows why. It shouldn't be $250,000. We have so many engineers and so on who study in this country who can stay. A bunch of arbitrary quotas that make little sense economically, and my alternative would take the government out of that decision and allow people to self-select. So it's a win-win situation as far as I can see. The only problem is that no politician seems to be interested in it.
That's not necessarily a bad thing.
No, I don't think it's a bad thing.
I don't like your idea. Alan Meltzer wanted to jump into this non-controversial issue.
I want to relate it to something I talked about earlier. My grandparents, your parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents came here when there were no rules about immigration. Anybody who wanted to come to America came to America. That's how America became America. The rules, even as late as the 1950s, we had the Bracero program in the Eisenhower years. It supplied the number of farm workers that we needed to harvest the crops because American labor didn't mostly want to do those things. What we've gotten is regulation. Regulation in the interest of special interest groups, particularly labor unions, and the current bill is full of those same kind of provisions. I teach in a major technical university. I spend part of the winter at a second major technical university, Stanford. Those two universities train a great number of people who come from China, India, Korea, to get an education in science and engineering. We don't let them stay. They're my students, so I know that many of them would like to stay because they see much greater opportunity for doing the things that they like to do here than they're likely to find in their own country. But we send them home. We send them home to compete with us. If there is ever a stupid policy, that is a stupid policy.
Actually, I should have phrased the question specific to American economic growth. When we bring Chinese students over, train them in engineering, and send them back to China, I'm talking about Chinese economic growth.
We teach them the latest technologies, save them the cost of having to find them themselves, and then they compete with us. I mean, how can you possibly believe that that's in the interests of the United States? That's the result of noxious regulation. And I must add, James Madison, the author of our Constitution in Federalist 10, warned us about factions. We call those factions interest groups. He said, the great threat to the democracy, the republic that we're developing, is when these interest groups, factions, become too strong. He didn't think that would happen because he thought they would compete against each other. Alas, they seem to compete against us and not against each other.
Either of you want to jump into this? Or?
Well, I would just say politically, I think Gary's recommendations have a lot, but there would be a lot of people in the La Raza group that say you'd have to change the entablature on the Statue of Liberty to enact his, give us you're tired, you're poor, all that. And as far as, I mean, it's a political issue. The reason that we don't have Chinese engineers or Indian engineers is that whether we like it or not, when we say illegal immigration or immigration in general, we're talking about immigration 70% from Latin America. And it's become very successful for the Democratic Party because it's changed the demography and the political reality of 3 or 4 states. And it's an issue that when you want to talk as we have, if the audience was different, if we were in a California audience, it'd be a very hostile reception. Because cui bono, who does the present system benefit? It benefits largely people from Latin America who are indigent and want to come to a place where it's it's a freer economy, they have freedom, they're treated with respect, and there's an enormous social net that's not in Mexico. Why does Mexico promote this? Because they get $30 to $40 billion in remittances, they have a safety valve of possible dissidents, and they find that the 11 to 14 million people from Latin America that they really don't want in Mexico or Latin America become nostalgic, and they become constituents that Mexico is concerned about in a way they never were when they lived in Oaxaca. So it's a win-win situation to Mexico to such an effect that the government published a comic book about how to cross the border illegally for its own citizens, which assumed that A, they could break the law of the United States, and B, they were illiterate because they needed to have a pictorial diagram how to do it. So there's a lot of cynicism there about it, and the political discussion, the subtext of the entire political discussion is the enormous political power of the immigrant lobby, La Raza. As I debated the Mexican consul in San Francisco, and I said to him at one point, if 3,000 people were being unloaded in freighters north of San Francisco Bay every day from Asia, would you object to that? He said, I would not only object, I would urge your government to stop it completely. And I said, well, why? The same thing is happening on the border of the United States. He said, yes, but we have historical claims on California. Not that that's representative, but if you look at the poll, the Pew poll did of Mexican citizens, what percentage of you think that the American Southwest is part of Mexico? 57% Mexico. The next question was, how many would like to leave Mexico to go to the United States? 56%. Think of the logic being that I don't want to live in the situation in which I've created, but I want to go somewhere else that's not like Mexico because I think it will be like Mexico. So there's been a lot of disconnect, illogic, political correctness, Orwellian euphemisms. And the result of it is that I think a lot of people who are on the ground level are not being represented, and they're being typecast as illiberal, and they have very legitimate concerns about the social, economic, political impact of bringing a lot of people into an entitlement society without skills of the type Gary warned us about, and under a multicultural paradigm that's not multiracial. One culture, many races, the melting pot, but a multicultural. As one last, I know I've talked too long, but one last point. When we say that most people don't want to be illegal immigrants. Under the Simpson-Mazzoli Act of 1986, we think only 50% took advantage of that. They didn't take advantage because there was a lot of work to do it. They had to register. They found that they could live as an illegal immigrant as well as a citizen, and their children would be citizens, and therefore they would be anchors to them. The student body president of Cal State Fresno, student body president, announced 3 years ago that he was an illegal alien. He dared anybody to deport him. He became a cause celeb. He then announced that he was engaged in a political campaign, which is illegal for a foreign national. And then he turned 2 weeks later, rammed his pickup into the marquee at Cal State Fresno and got over $80,000 in state assistance. And I can't believe that he thought there was a great disadvantage of being an illegal alien. There simply isn't in California. We can say there is in the abstract, but in the concrete, 14 million people don't think there is.
Gary, brief comment, and then I've got a question for Arnold.
All right, let me try to be brief. When you tell an academic to be brief, you should hold your breath about that. Let's consider the illegal immigrants from Mexico. I mean, what the problems are that they're coming in illegally when a lot of people have to wait for legal admission. My wife is an immigrant, and she's had brothers who have waited 10 to 12 years to get a green card while other people come in. So naturally, we consider that unfair. If you go to a system where, and I'll come back to my proposal, where you can buy the right to immigrate, then maybe a lot of Mexicans would take advantage of that right. I see no problem with that whatsoever. They would pay for the right to come. They would gain a lot, because you look at the average earnings of workers in Mexico, even unskilled workers in Mexico, compared to what they can get in the United States. Even when they're working the underground economy, they gain enormously. They go from like $1.50 to $2 an hour to $8 to $10 an hour. And so even these workers could easily pay off in 5 or 6 years from the additional earnings, the fee that I'm suggesting, $50,000. So we might get a lot of low-skilled workers from Mexico and elsewhere, but the United States has always attracted low-skilled workers. These are workers who have the ambition for their children themselves to become skilled, and they've been a great foundation of the success of the United States. So I would say the problem is not that we're getting immigration from Mexico. I think the problem is that we have no means by which, first of all, we can control the illegal immigration, no means by which the illegal immigrants can convert themselves into legal status other than through amnesty and similar programs. And I think we have to offer such an alternative, and I think many of them, not all of them, I agree with you, not all of them would take advantage of that, so it wouldn't eliminate that issue. But many of them would take advantage of that because there is a considerable advantage to being legal, even if your children were going to be legal in the next generation.
John, you had a comment.
I just had a sort of a side comment on this. It relates to our topic of economic freedom. There are a substantial number of foreign-born graduate students in economics who come to study. So in the PhD program at Stanford, it's probably 85%, and I'm sure it's Chicago and Carnegie not too far different. And that means, of course, that they usually don't have trouble staying because they're going to get a job at top universities and they're going to be able to get their papers to stay. So as a result, you're sort of seeing the assistant professors are becoming largely foreign-born. So there's a phenomenon that's quite interesting to me. I actually think that it's quite promising in a way because, for many reasons, it's kind of a world market and you're getting the best and the brightest here, and some of them are staying. But also, with respect to this economic freedom concept, many of them are coming from places where they value the economic freedom. They value the things that we've stressed here. And so I think that will tend to be a beneficial thing with respect to the way our discipline of economics evolves over time.
Arnold Harberger, you and Milton Friedman gave economic advice to promote free markets in Chile during the Pinochet regime. In your experience, does economic freedom promote political freedom?
Oh, well, number one, Milton really believed that. And he was very explicit about that when he was in Chile on any number of occasions. I've taken a more nuanced attitude up because you've had a lot of economic freedom in Singapore, and Singapore isn't a terrible authoritarian state, but it is an authoritarian state, and it doesn't seem to be just disappearing all by itself, and I think we can find other examples of that kind. But the Chilean experience is really quite interesting in that many people ask me all the time, how terrible it was to have that military government, and why did people work for the military government, and so on. And my students were very important in that role, and Milton and I ran into a lot of buzzsaws after that time because of the link to the Pinochet government. What do I see? Number one, these guys who were there put in fantastic reforms. I mean, the top tariff was in the range of 100%, of 1,000% rather. The average tariff was in the range of 100%. And by the end of their period, it was brought to 10% uniform, from an average of 100% down to 10. They had 13 official exchange rates at the end of the Allende period, and that became one single free market exchange rate very rapidly. And tax reforms, other reforms, all the way were very good. during that period, criticism of economic policy was very freely allowed, and there was an entity, CIPLAN, financed mainly by the Ford Foundation, which was opposition people freely expressing those ideas. But I think the particular, very strong changes in economic policy that took place within such a short period, in that atmosphere in Latin America, no democratically elected government would have been able to do that. So, but now comes the interesting thing. 90% of those Chilean reforms have subsequently been adopted by numerous Latin American governments all over the continent. So you can't say so anything in the reforms is undemocratic. It was the fact that the shock value of big change was made more possible by the military government. Second thing is the military government self-destructed in Chile. And I think that's something of a miracle. There are kind of three miracles. The miracle of making these economic policies, the miracles that the military self-destructed by creating a constitution which led then to 4 successive presidents who were from the opposition to the military. Third miracle is these 4 presidents implemented economic policies which did not seriously in any way reverse what the so-called Chicago Boys had done, but quite the contrary, carried them further. So that at the moment of the transition to democracy in Chile, there had been a crisis, and the 10% uniform tariff had ended up at 15% at that time. The new anti-military government dropped that to 11. A subsequent anti-military government dropped that to 6%. Subsequent anti-military governments made huge quantities of free trade agreements, with the result that today the average tariff of Chile, the tariff collections divided by value of imports, is in the range of 1% to 2%. Now, I think this miracle of the opposition embracing and enhancing the market-oriented policies of the predecessor is the third Chilean miracle. And I'm really very proud of all 3 of them.
Awesome. Gary?
Yeah, let me comment on it. Let me first of all say that Al, by far more than anybody else, was responsible for training those Chicago boys who went back to Chile and made these enormous reforms. Let me comment on the more general issue. I do think there's a connection between economic freedom, I don't know if I'd call it just political freedom, but civil freedom in general. You could take Singapore, Al, or you could take China. Now, I was on a panel about a year ago with 2 eminent other panelists, and one of them was saying how unfree China was, and the other one was saying how much progress China had made. And they were both right. I mean, so you go back to the period like 1979 when China started its reform in agriculture. You had no freedom, virtually no freedom. In any way, people wore the same outfits even. They couldn't go into Chinese couldn't go into hotels that were visited by foreigners. You look at China today, you still have communist government, so it's not politically a free society. On the other hand, you look at the amount of freedom individuals have, even to criticize the government, to travel, to go where they want, to migrate. It's manyfold greater than it was at that time. And it's not an accident. In the modern world, which is very much knowledge-based, it's hard for an economy that wants to progress, whether it's democratic and non-democratic government, without giving its citizens a certain amount of freedom to acquire this knowledge through the internet, through travel, in other dimensions. And so you can stay very poor. You can be in North Korea. You don't have economic freedom. You don't have any other freedom. But if you want to experience economic growth I think it's inevitable that you have to allow a pretty significant amount of freedom, even if it may not be political freedom, but that people will have freedom to criticize, freedom to get information in various sources. And you still have people being put in prison, like in a country like China. It's not politically free. You still have the internet being censored, although the Chinese have found ways to get around the censorship in a variety of ways because of software made in the United States that they use to get around the Chinese censors. So I think particularly in the modern world, it's a very optimistic view. A country that wants to have economic freedom is going to have to allow a greater amount of general freedom than was traditional in the old Soviet Union, the early days of communism and the like. So to me, I think there is a connection, and I think economic freedom does drive general freedom, although it may not lead to competing political parties and political freedom, but I think people become a lot freer more generally.
John?
Yeah, I think there's a connection that's sometimes subtle and it's hard to see, and it most frequently shows up where you restrict economic freedom and you see restrictions on other kinds of freedom. And I would say, one example, you see it a lot of it just recently. I'll just give a personal story which is public. Dick Kovacevic was running Wells Fargo at the time where he was asked to take TARP money. And he was actually told, if you don't take this money, we're going to send your chief regulator after you and declare you capital inadequate. He was very reluctant to tell that story until he was out of being CEO of Wells Fargo, and now he tells it. And you ask him why, he says, well, I can't really speak out like that. These are the people who are regulating me. Milton Friedman would talk about this a lot, about how these restrictions on economic freedom would effectively remove the tendency towards free speech. So I see it's out there. It's related to the crony capitalism. It's there. It's right within our society. I think also, if you just think about the healthcare law, there's some, if you like, restrictions on economic freedom about what people can do, but that's impinging now on religious freedom in many ways. So you have to look at, I think, at the details and how this builds up, and you'll see quite a few connections in my view.
John, this next question is for you and Alan. What, briefly, is the proper role of the Fed in promoting economic growth? I know that briefly part is kind of tough. And as kind of a fun add-on, would you reappoint Ben Bernanke as head of the Fed? Start with John and move on.
Well, we've had a lot of evidence about what works in monetary policy. I think the policy of the 80s and 90s, really until recently, worked very well. We had a period with a great amount of stability. Unemployment came down, inflation came down, growth picked up. And so you want a monetary policy like that. It's basically kind of steady. It doesn't have go stop. There's not lots of interventions. It's predictable. It's actually quite rule-like. And when other countries have followed policies like that, they've performed well. Now we're really completely off track in that there's a huge, unprecedented interventions. It's hard to predict. You can see some of the damage that can be caused in the last few weeks when people are uncertain what the next steps are going to be. You get in a precarious situation, and quite frankly, I don't think it's worked. I think it's one of the reasons we've had this very slow recovery, despite all these actions the Federal Reserve has taken. So that's the kind of policy you want to get away from. We want to get back to the policies. It's a different world. It's not exactly the same, but policies like that, rule-like, if you like. And with respect to the future, I think you want to find someone who can deliver that kind of policy, and it's not going to be easy. Paul Volcker was appointed at a time where it was also very difficult. You needed a big change. He orchestrated that, and you need a person like that.
Alan?
I agree with John completely. The way I approached that question, I did an interview with Reuters about it, which they circulated, and in the process they asked me, who would I appoint? Would I appoint Bernanke, the question you had? Who would I appoint? So I gave the kiss of death to my friend John Taylor by saying I would appoint him. Why? Because compare the Volcker policy, as John just did. What was different about the Volcker policy? Volcker had a long-term objective. He knew where he wanted to go. He knew he wasn't going to get there in a month or 6 months or even a year. He knew he was going to slog his way, step by bloody step, toward a goal. But he had that goal in mind. In almost the first week that he had changed the policy toward what he called practical monetarism, he was on Meet the Press. He did an interview. Irving R. Levine, who was a major NBC economics commentator, asked him, well, when you get the inflation, won't there be unemployment? Volcker said, you think, as Bernanke does, that there's a trade-off. But I look at the record and I see that inflation and unemployment rose together, and I'm going to make them go down together. That was his long-term objective. Now, what does Ben Bernanke say? I think Ben Bernanke was a very fine economist, and I have nothing personal against him, but I think he's been a terrible chairman. What does he say almost every day? I have to wait for the next monthly data to decide what I'm going to do. That's the wrong way to run the policy. You want to run the policy based upon having a clear objective, convince people you're going to do it. Look what happens. One day, somebody says, we're going to end QE. The market tanks. The next day, someone says, we're not going to end QE. The market goes up. So all that variance gets put into the economy. For what purpose? No good purpose that I can think of. Let me finally say something about QE. I looked at what does QE actually accomplish. After all, we have this enormous tripling of the size of the Fed's balance sheet, an announcement that if they carry through on their objectives, they're going to add another $1 trillion worth of reserves to the system this year. What has that accomplished? 98% of the money is in excess reserves. Banks are sitting on the money, collecting 0.25% interest rate on trillions of dollars, and not anxious to take risky loans. They'll lend to General Electric or IBM or Google, but they're not going to lend to newly marrieds, to startup companies, because the risk isn't rewarded by the interest rate. Now, they could raise the interest rate and cover the risk, but they don't do that. What they do instead is lend money to the government by holding excess reserves, collecting big dividends, borrowing money at very low rates, investing in government bonds, taking taxpayers' money, using it to pay dividends, increase their bonuses, build their capital. That's a terrible set of policies. It's not working to the benefit of the public. And that's because the Fed has many problems. You know, in its 100-year history, there are two periods, only two, in which it produced an outcome that had low inflation, relatively stable growth, and short, small recessions. Those two periods were 1923 to 28, when we were on a rule called of the type of gold standard. And the other period was from 1985 to 2002, 2003, when we followed, not precisely, but more or less all the time, on average, the Taylor rule that John developed. Those are the two best periods. They were on a rule. There is hardly any, with one possible exception, the 1950s, when the Fed produced results similar to that, although there were many more recessions in the 1950s. Discretionary policy does not work to the benefit of the public. Rule-based policy forces them to concentrate on longer-term objectives. The way they run their policy is they're concentrating now on inflation. They're going to wait probably too long, if history is any guide, to deal with inflation. Then they'll respond to inflation. That will increase unemployment. The reason that the Taylor rule worked as well as it did was because during that period they looked at both objectives. So we had what is called the period of moderation. That is, there wasn't a lot of variability, and there wasn't a lot of uncertainty. They had a clear objective, and they were aimed at that clear objective. That's the way to run a central bank. We need somebody who will do that. Paul Volcker more or less did it, and that's why his policy ultimately proved to be very successful and ushered in the period when they more or less followed the Taylor rule. Let me say finally, no rule is going to work all the time in all circumstances. There's uncertainty in the world, and unanticipated changes occur, so you have to have some flexibility. But rules work very well on average, as those two periods, the only two in Federal Reserve history where we produced the results which were most conducive to the kinds of things which the public would like to have.
Before we go to audience questions, I have one fun question to finish up with, and that is, we know who the new Federal Reserve Chairman is going to be. It's going to be John Taylor. Who's going to be the president who appoints John Taylor? On the current political scene, what person who might be a presidential candidate has impressed you as being someone who really gets it in terms of economic growth and opportunity? And I'll start with Arnold Harberger.
Let me pass for the time being.
Gary, anybody?
I like Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan is a policy person. He enjoys talking policy. He understands economic issues. I think his proposals for medical reform are really, on the whole, very good proposals.
He's getting a problem.
He understands the need to get the economy growing more rapidly. I mean, the most depressing thing about the last 4 years, in many respects, is a very slow rate of growth. Typically, after a major recession, we grow rapidly and return to some long-term trend line, which is about 3% growth of GDP per capita. Not only haven't we returned to this trend line, but we've been growing at around 2% per year in GDP. So we're getting further and further away from the trend line. I think Ryan understands the need to install policies that will increase the growth rate. I don't think we can get to 4% growth, as some people are estimating, but we can get back to the 3% growth rate that we've averaged since 1880 through Great Depressions. Who else? That would be a great achievement. I think Paul Ryan has the understanding to be able to do that. Does he have the political drawing power? I'll leave that to political pundits to judge, but I think he has the understanding to do it.
Victor?
Well, I wish that Mitch Daniels had been a candidate. I know that he's the recipient this year of the Bradley. I'm not trying to give him a plug for the Bradley Foundation, but I am essentially. I think when he was the budget director, I think he warned very early in 2002 what would be the political consequences of the budget deficits under the Bush administration. Of all the Republican replies to a State of the Union address from the Republican side, I thought his was the best. It was sober, judicious, calm, insightful. He's had executive experience. He's been a governor. I think I'm a little worried that after the Obama Senate basically 2.5 years in the Senate without any executive experience, that's sort of tarnished that pathway to the presidency in a way that Rand Paul and Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, you don't see that they've had a lot of executive experience. So I wish that people might persuade him to be a candidate, because I think he's ideal.
Another kiss of death, Alan?
No, I hope. Let me say, what are the qualities that we want to look for in a president that we don't find, unfortunately, in the present president? I would list 3 most important. First is life experience. The fact that you've grown up and been through the school of hard knocks, as it used to be called, and you've learned that every day is not a good day. And you've learned to deal with that and come out on top. That is, you were able to surmount the problems you had. Second, an ability to compromise. This president does not have an ability to compromise. You know, people say the American government is broken. The American government is broken when we don't have somebody with leadership and an ability to compromise. Ronald Reagan, the friend of all the conservatives, he certainly knew how to compromise. He could agree in 1982 to, he didn't like the word tax increases, so it was revenue increases. He told me in my brief experience with him 3 times about his experience. He had the Democratic leadership in. They agreed to $2 of expenditure reduction for each dollar of revenue increase. He said they didn't get out to the White House lawn before they reneged on the agreement. But he knew that you had to compromise, that you had to get agreement, and that there were people that you had to get in to do the things that you want to do. So he often said, we'll get 80% this time, and we'll get the next 20% later. Compromise. Leadership, compromise, life experience. Those are the things we need. I like Mitch Daniels too. I think he would be a good president and would know how to lead and get compromise, because he was able to do that in the state of Indiana, as Reagan was able to do it in the state of California. I think Paul Ryan would be great. He is a smart, knowing him a bit, he's smart, knowledgeable, and studies the issues and thinks about them and comes up. And he's had the courage, and it takes courage, to come up with a budget that cuts social spending. There aren't many. Think about how many other people there are who would take a leadership position like that, and not only take it, but get the Republican in the House to agree to it. It's quite a performance.
Just a quick word on Mitch. I remember several years ago urging him to enact school choice in Indiana, and he said, I'm going to do it in my last year of office. And generally speaking, the rule of thumb that I had learned over the years was if someone says they're going to do it in their last year of office, that means they're not going to do it. Mm-hmm. By golly, Mitch did it. Indiana has a statewide school choice program, and that guy, I have to say, and a very good one, that guy made a believer out of me. The Bradley Foundation knows how to pick them. Last but not least, John.
Well, let me just, like Alan, mention a couple ingredients or characteristics I think are important, especially on the economic side. One is having the right philosophy on these economic freedom issues, and having thought about it, written about it, spoken about it for as long as possible is so important. And of course we saw that with Ronald Reagan. Second, is slightly different than what Alan's indicating. I think you need to bring that philosophy to government with you and know how to execute it, and convince people of it. It's obviously compromise is necessary, but more important, get the people, bring people with you who are of that same philosophy. Ronald Reagan had Milton Friedman as a top advisor. He had George Shultz as a top advisor, on another from Chicago coming from the business school. He appointed people to the Treasury, which were Chicago school. You didn't see many people at the Council of Economic Advisors from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Most of them were from, at least from UCLA. And I think that's really important, to be able to deliver that, and part of convincing the American people. So I like the names that have been mentioned, and great respect for Mitch, and congratulate him on this prize today. I know Paul Ryan very well, and we actually wrote an op-ed on monetary policy, quite along the lines of what Alan and I were talking about. He and I wrote an op-ed together, and I do think he speaks. He's thought about the issues a lot. It's fascinating to read some of his speeches. Even since he's reemerged after the after the campaign. So there's a lot of attractive features to him. But I'd say maybe just since I'm the last here, we have a good bench of people who have thought about the issues. Clint's co-author, Jeb Bush, is obviously one who has introduced a lot. We mentioned Mitch Daniels, and there's quite a few. I think in that sense, it's an optimistic field for the future.
Not a single person mentioned Joe Biden. I am just so crushed. With that, actually, I apologize. We have brought this to a crescendo right at the moment that we are supposed to close. I'd like to ask each and every one of you to join me in thanking and commending this outstanding panel.
Thank you, Clint. Good job.
Could all be back here at 10:15 promptly. That would be great. The refreshment station has been recharged, and the restrooms are down here to the left.